Okay, hey guys. So chapter 30, Cold War policy. So we talked about Reaganomics, right? We talked about Reagan's rise to power and sort of what was going on domestically, but there's also a lot going on with our foreign policy, which is going to be very important to discuss. Um, and so let's take a quick look back at the Cold War, right? Because the Soviet Union still exists, that's all there. So we're going to sort of look at its collapse and the revamping of the Cold War in the 80s. So through the 70s, right, after Vietnam, the Cold War has very much calmed down a little bit. So we'd gotten involved in Vietnam after getting involved in Korea, right? The 50s and the 60s were, this heightened tension, so much fearfulness surrounding the Soviet Union and communism and it spreading here. And we, had our policy of containment in place where we were trying to prevent it from spreading. We had the Truman Doctrine in place where he's like, we're going to go out anywhere in the world where communism is and we're going to prevent it from spreading and save those people and preserve democracy and freedom and whatnot. So that had been the early parts of the Cold War, right? That's the 50s and the 60s. So in 65, we get involved in Vietnam officially, once again, to prevent the spread of communism, right? To protect us from the domino theory, from each country one by one falling to communism, but also to protect the Southern Vietnamese and to prevent Russia from gaining any more power. But clearly, right, as we talked about, Vietnam did not go over well by the end of the war. It became incredibly unpopular. We began questioning our role there. And so after we get unentangled from Vietnam, after we leave, we are going to see the Cold War sort of calming down a bit. Not only has the Soviet Union calmed down, but so have we. So we're going to start passing things like the SALT treaties, right? The Strategic Arms Limitation treaties. We'll pass one under Carter, pass a similar one under Nixon too, I believe. But we're going to see both sides, right, both us and the Soviet Union sort of agree to these terms. And what the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaties are, just as a reminder, right, SALT 1, SALT 2, things like that, are an agreement with the Soviet Union that we are going to have less weapons, basically. So we put caps on the type of weapons that we can have, as well as how many weapons we can have. So we basically try to like descale our nuclear programs, right? Because we had more bombs like times a million than was necessary to destroy the entire world. So we're like, let's maybe like mellow there just a little bit, right? We don't need this many. So we had seen this decrease. But we are going to see a ramping up of the Cold War once again in the 1980s. Reagan wanted to strengthen America's defenses. He wants to recapture the supremacy from the USSR, right? This is the whole idea of we're not in an inevitable decline. We are going to protect ourselves. We are going to be a great country once again. We're going to be at our sort of height of strength and being heroes and all of that as we were in the post-World War II era. So he wants to make us the greatest nation in the world once again, and that includes military strength, right? That's the idea. We want to be the most powerful and the most protected and all of that. Plus, if we remember back to his early years, right, Reagan also is not a fan of communism. He does not think it's a good thing. So he really got his political start in the anti-communist movement of the 1950s, right, and the late 1940s. So this has very deep roots for him, for why we're sort of going to ramp this up. In reality, once again, this is an important reminder too, we point to Reagan for so much of this and because he made all of these problems so much worse. But once again, this was Carter and the Democrats who started this process. So the Democratic Party and the Democratic Congress and Carter had started another military buildup in 1979. We had increased the defense budget by 5%. And this is largely in response to the Soviet Union invading Afghanistan. So when the Soviets invade Afghanistan, we're like, oh God, like maybe you're stepping things up again. We're not okay with that. So we are going to increase our defense spending in case we need to. And so that does start under Carter. But Reagan will continue that. And he sees the Soviet Union as a very serious threat because they're invading places. So in terms of Reagan's overseas foreign policy, which ties directly into the Cold War, he sort of views America as having lost standing under Carter, right, with the Iranian hostage crisis, with allowing for the invasion of Afghanistan, right? And so he wants to sort of stand up and have more of a hard line. He says this is unacceptable. So that's what we're going to see here. So we're going to spend a lot of money. on defense, right? So the Secretary of Defense, a guy named Caspar Weinberg, proposed a plan that more than doubled defense spending. And the emphasis was on creating new weapons in the 1980s. So we'll create things like the B-1 bomber, MX nuclear missiles, and we increase our Navy. So we're going to go up from 456 ships to 600 ships, which is a huge increase. And it's very expensive. We see growing opposition in Congress, but by 1985, the defense budget was more than $300 billion, which was a lot of money, right? And this, defense spending can be a popular thing. It's protecting America, right? It's making sure that we are safe and our borders are safe. But we are going to be spending a lot, right? That is a lot of money. And particularly when we start to see the growing deficit and when we have this economic crisis, right? This isn't going to be sustainable or affordable. Reagan was cutting taxes, right? He ran on a platform of smaller government and cutting taxes, which again, those two things can go together very well. But the problem is he's not actually making smaller government, right? He's increasing the power of the U.S. government, and he's expanding it into the military sector. So we see a huge increase in military spending, and that's not going to be financially viable or sustainable with the amount of revenue that we're making. So this is adding to the deficit that we talked about in the last chapter, and adding to a little bit of the instability of the economy. So eventually Reagan, like we talked about too, will cut down on this. But in the early years of the 1980s, we see this rapid increase, and we're building a lot of new stuff, like crazy and kind of awesome new stuff, right? The very, like, I don't know, the technology and the stuff that we're capable of creating is insane, but still, it's a lot of money to be spending on this. So Reagan's approach to the USSR, right, to Russia, is basically they are, quote, the focus of evil in the modern world. And Reagan sort of creates what becomes known as the evil empire. He sees the Soviets as the focus of that evil empire. They're a deadly enemy who threatened U.S. security and was hell-bent on world domination, which sounds pretty scary, right? So obviously we as Americans, as the good guys, need to stop this evil empire who's hell-bent on world domination. And once again, you can kind of see, this Reagan wanting to be that good guy, wanting to be that hero shining through, right? It's not this like super malicious, terrible thing. It's like this is where he got his background, was this anti-communist stuff, and he wants to ride in and save the day and be this heroic figure for America against this scary, evil empire. And so, I mean, you can see this with this quote here, right? Sort of the irony here. So he says, Soviet-sponsored guerrillas and terrorists are at work in Central and South America, in Africa, the Middle East, and in the Caribbean and in Europe, violating human rights and unnerving the world with violence. Now, of course, we were doing a whole lot of that, too, in order to counteract the Soviet-sponsored guerrillas. We were, funding our own guerrillas. Right, we're going to fund the Mujahideen, which are then going to grow into the Taliban, which are then going to grow into Al-Qaeda and eventually into ISIS. Right, so we're doing the same things, but we're doing it just in our minds. Right, we're being good guys because we're stopping the USSR and this world domination. Now, to be fair, too, the Soviet Union is going around and invading countries, and that's not good. We don't want them invading Afghanistan or just taking over more territory, right? They have a tendency to do this, even now, right? When a couple years ago, Putin invaded Ukraine and just took a good chunk of it over and it's like, this is now mine. So not a great policy, but just kind of ironic because we're doing the same stuff. So I know we already talked about a lot of this, but we're just going to do a quick review here as well. So I kind of mentioned this on the first slide, but let's look at our sort of previous Cold War policy, right? I thought the Cold War was over. Well, it's not. So by the end of the 1960s, we see the Cold War, so end of the 1960s, beginning of the 1970s, once we shift our attitude towards Vietnam, we really see the Cold War losing its intensity, right? Both us and Russia are pretty aware that we can destroy the entire planet. So we were faced with a choice. Do we slow down Cold War competition, right? Do we decrease our arms production and begin limiting how many weapons we can have and what type of weapons we can have? Or do we continue an arms race that could end in all-out war? Luckily, Nixon chooses to not have all-out war, and he's going to adopt a policy of détente. Now, this is a term you should know. So détente is basically slowing down Cold War competition, right? So decreasing the number of arms we're making, putting limitations on what type of arms we can have, and things like that. So we really are adopting this policy. And through the 70s, we're going to see a decrease in the Cold War as a whole. Right? It's still tense. We still don't trust Russia. The Soviet Union's still in full effect. But both of us have agreed that we will decrease how many weapons we have. And we definitely see a mellowing out of policy across the board. But this will all come crashing down because, it tends to. So Carter becomes president, right? He gets inaugurated in 1977. And he will sign into effect something called the SALT Treaty, right? SALT II. So we've talked about this before. So we had SALT I, but SALT II is the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty numero dos. And SALT II was supposed to set precise limits on the numbers and types of strategic arms that each nation could have and could maintain, right? So Carter actually signs this, but it's not ratified by Congress. And it's not ratified because Congress urges them not to ratify it. And the reason all of this happens is because, and this is sort of going to lead us down this path towards ending détente, right, abandoning détente. But Russia, the Soviet Union, invades Afghanistan. And so in 1979. And so for us, we go, hold on. If you're going to be aggressive like that, if you're going to invade somewhere else, we're not having that. We're not going to adopt this policy if that's going to be your attitude. So, despite the fact that Carter had signed it, he actually goes to Congress and he's like, please don't ratify this, right? I don't think that you should ratify it because of the Soviet Union's actions in Afghanistan. So we're going to see, this is the sort of the start of the abandonment of détente, right, of decreasing this. So Reagan will jump on this sort of pattern, and he is going to promise increased military spending with the end goal being peace, right? Very, very similar attitude towards as like Szilard had, right? And so he begins to place Pershing II missiles and cruise missiles in Western Europe within range of Moscow and other well-populated Russian areas. And we do this in response to the fact that Russia had placed medium-range missiles aimed at different NATO countries and had invaded Afghanistan. So we're starting to, once again, kind of escalate back to this position where we have strategic missiles placed, we are capable of taking each other out if need be. And then in 1983, other NATO countries are also going to start placing weapons bases in Great Britain and in Germany so they can counter Russia as well. So we see this increase in weapons being pointed at each other, which is abandoning this policy of de-escalation, right? That is an escalation. So we're abandoning détente. Now, one of the other things that we're going to see develop here is the program of Star Wars. Now, this is not the movie. This was an actual name for a weapons program that we wanted to create. God, I cannot stop yawning. Sorry. So Star Wars will be a strategic defense initiative aimed at creating cool new weapons in space. So Star Wars refers to the development of this crazy new military technology, but it's all technology in space, which makes it even cooler in people's minds, and this is why we call it Star Wars. And so a big push for this is fear of ICBMs, which are intercontinental ballistic missiles. These are missiles that can go from one continent to another continent, right? Which means that we feel at risk. And so we begin to develop and discuss an anti-missile system, and that's really what Star Wars is going to be about. So what we propose with Star Wars is the use and development of lasers and other new particle beams and new technology to destroy missiles in outer space. So we tried to make space lasers, which didn't end up happening. But we thought that was going to be the most brilliant new idea, right? And this is genius. So the idea was we'll make space lasers, and those space lasers can then shoot down all these missiles which are coming, and then we'll be super safe and protected. Also, spending a whole lot of money. So while we're trying to make space lasers, the Soviet Union is actually creating more accurate and more effective and longer range ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. So we could have just done that instead. Critics of the Star Wars program say this is not going to work. And if it did work, it will only escalate the arms race further. And then the USSR will try to build better offensive missiles. And then we'll try to build better space lasers. And it will all just get completely out of hand. But people who are in support of it, of course, say, well, this is a great way to protect the United States, right? More protection means we are safe, especially from something that could take out such a huge number of Americans so rapidly. The other goal here, which is an important one, because this will become very important with the end of the Soviet Union, is one of the other goals is to outspend the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union does not have as much money as we do. And they couldn't keep this up the way that we could. And so the hope is that our spending forces them to try to spend to keep up, which would ultimately destabilize them or cause them to back down and get rid of their weapons, in which case we win, right? So it's sort of like the downside is we're spending a ton of money, but we see the upside is either we're going to spend so much that they will end up being destabilized because they won't have enough money to do the things that they need to do, or they'll back down altogether. And this does play a role. The Soviet Union is going to try to spend to keep up, and that's going to cause a lot of problems at home domestically. And by the end of the 1980s, we do see the Soviet Union collapse. So between the two countries at this point, we do have over 50,000 warheads in nuclear arsenals, and could easily destroy the entire world, just like we could easily destroy the entire world today, multiple times over. Hooray. By the way, we don't end up making space lasers, just to make that clear. Proposed program, that's kind of funny, but we don't actually make space lasers. Okay, so meanwhile, we have no peace in the Middle East. And this is going to be important for multiple reasons, but we'll work through this. So the Middle East is not getting any more peaceful, and this is only going to cause more foreign policy programs. So quick recap here. Israel is founded in 1948. And most people in the Middle East were not super stoked on this, right? But we are buddies with Israel. For us, Israel is a base and an ally in a region that we don't have very many allies or bases, and in a region that's becoming increasingly important, largely too because of oil, right? So the reaction to the rest of the Middle East is not pleasant when Israel gets created. And so Israel, there's going to be several different fighting back and forth, but Israel and Egypt are going to go to war in 1973. And when Israel and Egypt go to war, obviously we're going to be backing Israel. But this is going to lead to something very important, which I'll just put up here right now, which you guys don't have on there, but this is going to lead to the development of something called OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. There we go. OPEC. So the organization, OPEC here, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, is founded by many Middle Eastern countries who exported oil. Right? And in response to the war between Israel and Egypt, they say, we are not going to export any oil to any Western country who is friendly with Israel, i.e. us, obviously, right? And so that is going to be a huge hit on Americans because gas prices are going to quadruple, right? They're going to skyrocket. And this also is one of the reasons why we see the rise of new conservatism, right? This is one of those economic issues that is just playing into this. When oil is so expensive, it affects people's daily lives, right? Suddenly your budget is how much you're spending on oil every day, which is a lot. Anyone who commutes, anyone who drives anywhere, that's a very vital part of how much you're being forced to spend. And if that goes up that much, that's a huge strain on people economically. It also is really frustrating. People get really pissed off. So that's going to play a big role in this as well. So that's important to remember. So Israel and Egypt are fighting. OPEC is not selling us any oil. People aren't happy about this. But then good old Jimmy Carter is going to come along. So in 1979, Jimmy Carter performs one of the best moments of his presidency. And he orchestrates the Camp David Accords. Right. And the Camp David Accords are between the Prime Minister of Israel and the President of Egypt. And they meet at a presidential retreat in Camp David with Carter mediating, and they agree to a peace treaty, essentially. Egypt will say that Israel has a right to exist, right? They admit that Israel exists, and Israel relinquishes its claims to the Sinai Peninsula, which is an area that they had been fighting over. So they withdraw from Sinai, and Egypt's like, okay, you're a country, we get it. But they are going to continue Jewish settlement on the West Bank, which the U.S. had hoped they wouldn't, and we could make that a homeland for the Palestinians. But of course, that doesn't happen because we don't always get what we want. And it's complicated because it's always complicated. So they honor those accords. They do withdraw from Sinai. Egypt does recognize their existence. But again, they continue this settlement, which we had wanted as a homeland for the Palestinians. And so we're going to see increased fighting in the West Bank. So with the West Bank settlement, and the West Bank is a region in Israel. So with West Bank settlement, and no real place for Palestinians to go, right, who felt they had been displaced, we are going to see the development of something called the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And they're based largely in southern Lebanon, but would lead raids across the border into Israel. The PLO they'll begin doing these raids on Israel, and obviously that's not going to go over well with the Israelis. And so in order to counteract the fact that the Palestinians are, raiding them, and with some unspoken encouragement, Israel invades Lebanon with the intent of destroying the PLO. So things are just getting more and more messy. The U.S. basically made no attempts to stop this. We sort of egged them on a little bit. But they did help to get the PLO out a little bit. So we do get the PLO into Tunisia and find other places where they could go rather than just being sort of destroyed. But we're going to see war sort of develop. So with all of this craziness, right, things actually aren't getting that much better despite the Camp David Accords, despite this. And as we still know, right, there's still fighting taking place between Israel and Palestine. It's such a deep-seated conflict that it gets more and more and more complicated, unfortunately. So you can kind of see this on the map there, right? So here's Israel right there. Lebanon is where a lot of the PLO had gone, so they invade into Lebanon. For any of you who don't know, this is also where Syria is, which is where so much of the conflict is going on, and this is where Iraq is, so that's how we get ISIS, right? Iraq and Syria. And then we have Jordan down here. But this region too, right here, is the Sinai Peninsula. And then up here, right, we have Turkey. This is the Mediterranean. This is Iran. This is Egypt, right? Then we have Africa over here. So just to give you guys a visual. So with all this craziness, the U.S. manages once again to get ourselves involved in someone else's civil war, despite the fact that we're going to try to not do that. But, it's the Cold War and we're doing that, and the Middle East becomes increasingly important. So we end up involved in the Lebanese Civil War. So U.S. Marines are sent to Lebanon to restore order, but they unknowingly get in the middle of renewed hostilities between Muslim militias and Christian militias in Lebanon. Now, Lebanon has a deep-seated, crazy history, and their civil war stems all the way back to British colonialism and sort of the way the British ran those colonies before sort of jumping out. Basically, the Brits drew sort of an arbitrary line that paid no attention to historical hostilities between Muslims and Christian factions in Lebanon or any of the history there. Then they proceeded to play both sides against each other while they were ruling Lebanon, which only made tensions and things worse and sort of, played them off of each other, sort of giving benefits to one and then not to the other and sort of fostering that tension. And then they just left, leaving the country to fend for itself, which naturally led to civil war. So thank you, British colonialism. Anyways, we're involved now, right? We're going to get involved. The Muslim Lebanese saw the Marines, right, the U.S. Marines who were coming over, as aiding the Christian-run government. And so they're going to be targeting Americans a lot because they think that we're choosing sides, right? They think, well, obviously, because we were choosing sides. But we were supposed to be in there as neutral peacekeepers, but instead they see us as supporting the Christians rather than being there as neutral peacekeepers. Again, probably stemming out of British colonialism too. So out of this sentiment, they end up attacking American troops. And as this starts happening, there is growing congressional pressure at home to withdraw the Marines, right, to bring them back home. It's like, well, why are we putting them in harm's way? Why are they in the middle of this Lebanese issue, right? If we're having U.S. Marines attacked, like, that's not good. So there's congressional pressure to pull people out. But Reagan says, look, they're there for a reason. They're protecting the country from a Soviet-backed Syria, and he refuses to pull them out, right? Because, again, Syria is right next to Lebanon. So he says, no, it's crucial that we're there because if we leave, then with the domino theory, right, which we keep coming back to, Lebanon will probably fall to, Russian-friendly forces, and we'll see communism take over there too, and that would be awful. Ultimately, Reagan is forced to pull the U.S. Marines out of Lebanon after a suicide bomb attack. A suicide bomber drove a truck filled with explosives into an American barrack and killed 239 Marines in one instance, right? So once again, this makes us question, why are we there? And that's going to only increase pressure to remove Marines and bring our boys home, right? It's like, what is the point of being there? We're going to see the same type of questioning that we did after Vietnam, right? Why are we there? Why is this our business? Is this worth it? And there's a huge fear surrounding Vietnam. And that's something that's after Vietnam, surrounding like what happens if we go back to that position again. And that's something that's very important to understand in the aftermath of this, right? Our fear of getting entrenched in a war like Vietnam is going to dictate a lot of what we do. So we're going to particularly see this sort of as we get involved in the Desert Storm stuff. And as we get further involved in the Middle East, at least up until our invasion of Iraq, but we're trying to avoid that exact thing. We're trying to avoid what we ended up doing, but then we ended up doing it. But we're hesitant to go back to that place. So ultimately, we'll leave Lebanon, right? And we're going to leave the Arab-Israeli situation even worse than it was before, so nothing that we did helped. Oops. Oh, yeah, and we invade Nicaragua. So let's throw that on our list of foreign policy stuff. So this is going to start getting a little bit complicated. And I'm going to pause this really quick. Okay, I'm back. So Nicaragua. The Middle East is definitely not the only place we get involved. So we're going to look at Nicaragua now. So during Carter's presidency, he had been, before this even, right? We've been involved in Nicaragua for like the previous, 60, 70 years, right? On and off. We've also been doing, activities like this all throughout South America. If we remember back to our imperialism lecture, there's that whole slide that had all of the different times many of the different times that we've gotten ourselves involved in Latin America. So this is nothing new, but it is going to ramp up and change. So during Carter's presidency, Carter had been putting money in the form of aid into Nicaragua. And his goal was to strengthen the middle class in the original government called the Sandinistas. So the Sandinista government was being supported by Carter. And he wants the Sandinista government to try to, be supported by us and basically not the Soviet Union. So he's trying to prevent the Sandinista government from turning to the Soviet Union to get support in order to be successful, right? That's the hope. He doesn't want another Cuba. When Reagan takes power in 1981, he cuts off all aid to the Sandinistas. He says the Sandinistas drove out the moderates. They shouldn't, and so we shouldn't support that government, right? It's a government that's far too radical, has done some bad things with people, so we should not be supporting them. But once American money pulls out, once our support pulls out, Nicaragua turns to Cuban advisors in the Soviet military and are like, hey, what's up? Want to maybe give us some money? And so the Cuban advisors and the Soviet military assistants begin coming in and giving them money, and both of them also start aiding leftist guerrillas in El Salvador. So as a whole, they're also now trying to help support a leftist revolution, and more of a, possibly communist-based revolution in El Salvador as well. So this feels like it's spreading, right? They're trying to support revolutions in other countries. So in 1983, in an effort to remove the Sandinistas from government, who are now funding this, this other project and being backed by the Soviet Union, Reagan tries to fund exiles who had been exiled from Nicaragua, right, known as the Contras. So the Contras, this should all be on here, right? This is Contras down here, Sandinistas right there. So the Contras are Nicaraguan exiles who had left the country and were fighting with a base in Honduras and Costa Rica. Right? So that's sort of their base where they're fighting in. And they wanted to overthrow the Nicaraguan government. They want to overthrow the Sandinistas. So Reagan declares that national security of all the Americas is at stake in Central America. And Reagan goes to Congress and he asks for money and authority to fund the Contras and to get the Sandinistas out of Nicaragua. However, Congress is very fearful of another Vietnam. They're like, why should we get involved there? We don't want to, we don't need another civil war to get involved, and we don't have a great track record with that right now. So Congress refuses to give him the money. So Reagan, not happy with that answer and certain that he is right and needs to prevent the spread of communism, he goes basically covert and uses the CIA to back the Contras instead. So he goes, Congress, you won't do it? Well, hey, CIA, maybe you will. So now we have these U.S.-backed rebels, the Contras, fighting the Sandinistas who were in power, who we used to be funding, in this massive civil war. And this war takes a huge toll on Nicaragua, the country, and the civilians as a whole. And they really try to disrupt the Nicaraguan economy by any means that they could. They're responsible for blowing up oil tanks, mining harbors, carrying out countless raids on civilian villages. So we're backing this war that's creating horrible conditions for the people living there, with tons of war crimes and all of that terrible situation, which gets created out of this just mess to begin with. So the following year, right? So 1983, Reagan says, it's the national security of all the Americas is at stake. Please give us money. Congress says no. So 1984, the following year after Reagan had asked for aid, Congress passes something called the Boland Amendment. And the Boland Amendment prohibits any U.S. agency from spending money in Central America, right? Basically, once again, they're fearful of Vietnam Part 2, and with good reason. But the withdrawal of our funding right now that the CIA can't fund them, that leaves the Contras in a really bad position as well. So it's only going to get more complicated. So basically, we're meddling in other people's business, but instead of doing it fully, taking a side, following through, having a plan for rebuilding, all of it's sort of like half done, right? We give you help and then we take it away. And then we tell you we will be there and we will support you, and then we disappear, leaving you vulnerable. So our help doesn't follow through, which puts everyone in a really bad position because we're not, as a country and as Congress, we're not fully backing this. There's so much, division over what's the best route to take. And so ultimately we end up sort of causing more harm than good in a lot of these instances. So after the Boland Amendment is passed, basically we're supposed to be like, okay, we're out, right? We are no longer involved in this war. But this is when the Iranian-Contra affair takes place. So the Iranian-Contra whole affair surfaces in 1986, and this is huge. So the Iran-Contra affair was the American political scandal of the 1980s. Essentially, it comes out that high-ranking members in the administration of President Reagan had arranged for the secret sales of arms, so arms sales, right, weapons, to Iran, in direct violation of existing United States laws. And the profits from those arms sales, right, from selling weapons to Iran, were then, which is over $30 million, were then channeled into the Nicaraguan right-wing Contra guerrillas camp, right? So basically, we're selling weapons to Iran illegally and then taking that money and supplying the Contras, right, with money and supplies there as well to fight against the leftist Sandinista government, which also is a direct violation of U.S. policy, right? And this happens the year after the Boland Amendment was passed, which prohibited any money from going there. So totally illegal, right, on every account. And basically, what started this was the Reagan administration was sort of like, well, I don't agree with what Congress said. I don't like the Boland Amendment, so screw it. I'm going to do what I want anyway and do something completely illegal. So not good, right? This is a huge scandal. In November of 1986, as the Iran-Contra scandal broke, President Reagan's national security advisor, a guy named John Poindexter, and one of Poindexter's aides, a guy named Oliver North, began electronically destroying more than 5,000 email messages in the memory banks of the White House computer system. But what they apparently didn't know was that those messages were still retrievable from the email system's backup tapes. So they're destroying all these emails, which totally makes them look guilty, but they weren't actually properly destroying them. Like, if you're going to destroy evidence, like, at least do it properly. But they weren't. So investigators from the FBI and the Tower Commission, which is who was investigating this, pull these tapes and use them to reconstruct the whole Iranian-Contra scandal and affair. So in November of 1987, the year after, the committee who was looking into this, right, investigating this, issues a report that stated that ultimately the president bore responsibility for the implementation of his administration's policy, but found no firm evidence that he had known of the diversion of funds to the Contras. So they couldn't find any evidence that specifically said that Reagan knew about this. The scandal will continue to sort of be out there, and the issue is sort of like who is ultimately responsible and who knew. But again, we don't have any evidence to directly connect Reagan to this, so he's not like he's charged or anything. But again, this is like absurd that this is what we're doing. So in December of 1992, so this is at the end of President George Bush's presidency, right? So Reagan will serve his 2 terms. He'll leave office in 1989, and George Bush Sr. will be sworn in 1989, and he will be president for the next 4 years. So the end of Bush Sr.'s presidency, he issues pardons to many of the top government officials who had been charged or convicted for any part of their role in the Iranian-Contra affair, and Bush himself had also been implicated in the scandal but not charged, same as Reagan, again, because they didn't have any direct evidence linking them to the affair. An independent prosecutor and investigator ended up publishing his final report on the whole investigation in January of 1994. And he concluded that there was no clear evidence that Reagan had broken the law, but he noted that Reagan absolutely could have participated in, known about it, or participated in a cover-up of the event. We just can't prove it. So that's this huge scandal, right? Now, if we really think about this, I mean, think about where we are too. So not only do we have a president who is selling weapons to another country in order to fund rebels in another country, overthrowing a government who we used to once fund, but he's also doing this completely behind Congress's back after Congress told him no, right? So he is directly disobeying something, that, he's going outside of the balance of power, right? He says, I want to do this. Congress says no, right? That's supposed to be it. That's his check. But now he's going outside of that and doing something separate because he's so convinced that he's right. Additionally, we're selling weapons to Iran. Think about how we think of Iran right now. I mean, we are giving them some of the weapons and the capabilities to make the weapons that we're mad at them for having, right? Which, is fair. Like, we don't want Iran to get nukes. That would be terrible. But we're selling them, right, some of the stuff in the weapons in order to make them in the first place. Like, it's just so insane. So this is this massive scandal. But again, because there's no direct evidence, it doesn't ultimately taint Reagan somehow. And so both he and Bush get off, and then Bush pardons a whole bunch of other people as well, which is so mind-blowing to me. But hey. Okay. So finally, right, we've talked about how we are responding to Russia, but we also need to look at what's going on with Russia, okay? So they're still in control of many of the countries surrounding Russia proper, right? So we have the USSR has completely expanded, and they still have control of East Berlin. They still have control of East Germany. We still have the wall up dividing Berlin in half, right? But the USSR is undergoing some massive changes. Up until 1990, Gorbachev is leading the Soviet Union, and he will be leading it throughout the 1980s. And he's instituting new policies called perestroika, which is restructuring, and glasnost, something like that, which is openness. So these are two new attitudes sort of towards Russia as a whole and communism as a whole. And so these reforms that he's instituting allow for more freedom and more openness within Russia. They allow for elections, and so Gorbachev will become the first democratically elected president of Russia. However, in a weird way, this also undermines his presidency, especially with the removal of press censorship. So all of a sudden, right, with removing press censorship, with allowing for people to talk about things, all this stuff is coming out about how repressive the government was, and and so in a way that makes people still really frustrated with the government and want to overthrow it, even though it is being more progressive. So we're still seeing, in addition to this, we're seeing major changes not just in Russia proper, but throughout the Soviet Union as a whole and the countries that they're controlling. So we're going to see a series of sort of revolutions. In the summer of 1989, Hungary begins allowing East Germans to pass through in order to escape Germany. So Hungary sort of opens up their borders. And Hungary is on the way to Austria and West Germany. So it's like you can come through us to get out there. Hungary's actions essentially rendered the Berlin Wall irrelevant, right? The Berlin Wall was meant to keep people from going to West Berlin and then being able to escape into West Germany. And now that Hungary is just allowing that, it's less important that we have the wall in place. So in the fall of that same year, of 1989, several months after Hungary begins doing this, the East German regime, who was also sort of on the verge of collapse, the East German regime is on the verge of collapse. And so we are going to see sort of this big rising up and expression of frustration at the wall as a whole. So on November 9th, a whole bunch of very enthusiastic private citizens begin to demolish whole sections of the wall without any interference from government officials. They're sort of like, we get this is pointless. We're not going to try to stop you. Our government's kind of collapsing anyway. We're on the verge of collapse. And so East Germany sort of allows for the Berlin Wall to be removed as a whole. And so we have all these people literally going up with sledgehammers and taking apart the wall, and for the first time are able, to cross it and see their family on the other side, right? And be reunited with West Germany. So East Germany and West Germany will be officially reunited in 1990 as one nation, the Federal Republic of Germany. And so the Berlin Wall is now commemorated in several sections throughout the city, like we've talked about. There's a museum and a shop at one of the most famous crossing points, Checkpoint Charlie. There's still sections of the wall standing as the Eastern Gallery, right? You can still see the wall, the outline of the wall throughout the entire city. But this was such a huge moment for not just Berliners, but also everybody throughout Germany as a whole. Because the country is put back together once again. We no longer have this divide and this control that was still existent from World War II, right, where we had divided up Germany. We also will see, so that's 1989, we're also going to see sort of a weakening central government as a whole throughout many of these regions. So, and many different countries are going to begin revolting. So in Czechoslovakia, for example, we see the Velvet Revolution. And the revolution was a nonviolent transition of power. It started in November and lasted through December of 1989. So again, this year, after the Berlin Wall falls. We see popular demonstrations against the one-party government, which was the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. And both students and older dissidents will sort of display Czech solidarity and overthrow their government and institute a parliamentary republic, right? So institute a democratic republic once again, ending 41 years of communist rule in Czechoslovakia. In the Baltics, so Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, we have the Singing Revolution, which will take place over a series of years between like 87 through 91-ish, and is actually exactly what it sounds like. So they sing. So all three countries were able to gain independence once again with little bloodshed and reinstitute democratic governments, and they do a lot of this through protesting and through song. So the songs were tended to be old traditional folk songs or hymns that talked of national pride, and all of this stuff, all this old cultural heritage and all these songs had been banned under the communist regime. So Estonia had a whole series of rock concerts in parks as an act of defiance, and Latvia led public demonstrations in protest of the secret police while singing kids' folk songs, and Lithuania attempted to reinstitute some of the national symbols and monuments and songs that had been taken throughout the country. And all three countries at one point will end up forming a 373-foot-long human chain, like linked holding hands, basically, through their countries as a show of unity together. You can kind of see that here in this picture. It's a picture of the chain. So ultimately, the USSR is in this position, right, where they had accumulated more military commitments than they could afford. And with their sort of buffer countries rebelling, I mean, that's going to be really problematic for them as well. So it had overextended, right? It had been trying to aid too many people in too many parts of the country, and it didn't have enough money, or too many parts of the world, and it didn't have enough money to do it. Additionally, with the upstart of, kind of rebuilding with the Cold War stuff and all the money Reagan had been putting into building our military, the Soviet Union couldn't keep up, and the overspending is gonna destabilize them a little bit. And so with all these democratic reforms and the overextension, and the weakening central government, they're facing bankruptcy. And so they're finally going to collapse in 1991. After Boris Yeltsin seizes power. So Yeltsin up there. And in the aftermath of this, crazy coup, we have the whole country come crumbling down. So the Soviet Union as a whole falls. All of its little territories that it had taken over become independent once again. Communism is destroyed in the Soviet Union, and they are going to institute a new government. And a democratic government initially, until, of course, Vladimir Putin took power, who now has managed to position himself in complete control of the country once again, just not under the name of communism. He's just more controls everything. So in the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union, what America is going to be left with and what Russia is going to be left with is sort of like, how do we exist in this post-war world, right? How do we do this? It feels, we don't know what our foreign policy is going to be. For the last, several decades, our foreign policy has been completely dictated by communism, by the existence of the Soviet Union. That's how we've decided what we're going to do and where we're going to do it. But now that that's done, we really have to re-question and sort of look at our role in world politics once again, right? And that's going to be very significant for us. And we have to figure out where we want to get involved and where we don't. Where should we, help support people and where should we not? And so we're going to have some really big decisions to make in the aftermath of this. We also are going to start a process of reducing our nukes back again. So we're going to pass the START treaties. So S-T-A-R-T, START. So START 1 and START 2. And we'll start doing these under Bush and Clinton. And this is decreasing the amount of nuclear weapons that we have, right? So trying to rein that in. But this big question that sort of when we talk about the post-Cold War world, right, a lot of what we're going to have to figure out is, what is our role in that world? Right? Who are we going to be? What is our job in this new world without the Soviet Union in it? So that's what we're going to look at as we get into the 90s and the 2000s. Okay. Have a great weekend, you guys.